Hello and welcome back. This is Justin, and I'm starting my next part in the series where I am building a cabinet from scratch using pretty basic tools. So here's our product so far. For those of you that haven't seen, in part one, we built the box. Part two, we built the countertop. Today, we are tackling the doors. Let me show you my finished product over here. This is my test run that I made. And these are how my doors came out. So it's basically, let me zoom in here. It's basically a 1x3 piece that you make into four sides. You have to cut a groove in it. That's actually the tricky part. And then you get a very skinny piece of plywood that slides into the grooves. So it's a little tricky doing with, just a circular saw. And then, you mount your hardware and things like that we'll get into. But that's the idea of what we're looking for. So let's get to it. So I'm starting with cutting the sides of the door. I'm using a 1x3 select pine wood right here. So the vertical parts of the door, they call the stiles. The horizontal parts of the door, they call the rails. I want the stiles, the sides, to be the entire length of the door. And I want the rails, the middle, to be smaller. I want them to be, I want them to fit inside the rails. This way the cuts, will be on the top and the bottom. You won't see it. If my rails were longer, then the cuts would be on the side and it wouldn't look as nice. So the sides, the stiles, I want to be the entire length. And the rails, I want to minus the two widths of the stiles so that it fits inside. Once I have my pieces to length, I clamp them together and just sand them on the edge just so that they're like totally 100% the exact same length, in case I make my cut a little angled or whatever. So I just take some 120 and a sanding block and just smooth them out a little. Same with the sides, keep them clamped together and I just sand down the sides. I just want them to be totally identical. So when the doors come together, they look, the exact same. Okay, so here's where it gets kind of tricky. So what I'm doing is I have all my sides clamped together. My circular saw on the cutter guide. I have to start making a groove. I have to cut a groove inside the sides. So I set my depth to about 1/4 inch so that when I cut, it's making a 1/4 inch groove. I need to make that groove as thick as the 1/4 inch plywood that's going to go in between it. So what I have to do is I have to take my blade's only like, I don't know, maybe 1/8 of an inch thick. So I start with 1/8 of an inch groove right down the middle. Then I move my blade just so that it just hits the outside of it. So I have to make a couple passes to widen that groove. So about 3 passes of my blade is thick enough for that 1/4 inch groove. So I have to make one pass, move my blade just a little bit to the right, make one pass, and then move it back to center, and then back a little bit to the left, make one pass, and then I'll have 3 passes dead center of the side, 1/4 inch deep, so that plywood will fit right in the middle. It was pretty tricky to do, and when I make one pass, I have to take it apart, move the other piece of wood back to that same exact spot so that I put the groove has to be dead center on all 4 sides. If it's off, the plywood won't fit in nicely. So you have to make sure your cut is exactly the same on all 4 sides of your door. It took a little time. I think I messed up 1 or 2. So this was by far the hardest part of the project. So you'll see I have 4 pieces of wood here. I cut one stile plus one rail. This way when I had to make my groove, I only had to cut 4 long pieces. If I cut all my rails and then all my stiles, I would have had to cut a groove in 8 pieces of wood. But by doing it this way, I only had to cut a groove in 4 pieces of wood, and then when I cut the rails off, that groove will be the exact same piece of wood, so they'll mirror each other. So it just was a little easier doing it that way. And that's what I got. So now there's my stiles and rails, and you'll see that groove right in the middle. And because I cut the piece, you see how it matches so perfectly? By using that rail guide and making sure it was dead center each time, that ensures that the groove lines up perfectly on each piece of wood. Yeah, it was time consuming, you know, but again, I don't have a table saw, I have a circular saw, but it was pretty cool doing it that way, even though, like I said, it was a little time consuming. So I'm just dry testing it, making sure it looks good, making sure it's square. And then I'm measuring now the inside measurements. But then remember, my groove is a 1/4 inch deep. So I'm measuring the inside, adding a 1/4 inch to the top, a 1/4 inch to the bottom. So adding a 1/2 inch. So now when I cut my center plywood, it's going to be a 1/2 inch thicker on both sides so that it fits inside and then slides in the groove. And there it is installed. So now I have that piece of plywood, a 1/4 inch bigger on each side, and you'll see it, the rails and the stiles just kind of slide right into it. So once I tested it and made sure the plywood fit nicely in the grooves and it all came together nicely and it looked flush, I just add a little bit of glue on the 4 joints and clamp it tight. And that takes 30 minutes or so to dry. So here now I have the product dried. I have my 4 pieces clamped together, and that's pretty much the door. I'm ready to install hardware now. So I got this little kit. It came with a drill bit and a little plastic template. Made it pretty easy, but I think the basic rule of thumb was like your cabinets go 3.5 inches from the top and bottom of the door. So I'm just using my square to make a mark, and then I'm going to use that little template to make the center hole, and use the 1/2 inch drill bit that they gave me to screw in the hardware. So once I make the main center hole for the hinge, these hinges have the little like a little dowel, so you don't just screw it in, you drill, I think it's like a 3/8 inch hole, and then those dowels sit inside the hole, and then you use a machine screw to screw in, and that kind of widens the dowel, which grips it in place. So that's why that template is really helpful for making the main center hole and then the top and bottom dowels. once I have both hinges installed, I'm ready to mount it on the cabinet. So these hinges they go right to the inside of the face frame, and they just one screws right in. I'm using some wood underneath just to kind of make sure it's level and symmetrical. So when I do the other side and I lean it on that same wood, they'll line up perfectly together. Then the hinges have little adjustments just in case, the gap's not even in the middle, or if one needs to go a little more in or out. They have some screw adjustments for minor tune-ups. Close the door. Thanks, Bobby.
Go.
That's right, that's the door.